The thing about galactic civilization, and here we must pause to acknowledge the sheer audacity of calling it civilization, when half the species involved still settled diplomatic disputes with ritualized, screeching contests, was that it had developed a rather comprehensive classification system for planetary bodies. Not for scientific purposes, mind you. No, this was purely so that the more fortunate species could look down their various appendages at everyone else. At the top of this hierarchy sat the Paradise Worlds, Class 1 through Class 3, where the most aggressive life form might be a particularly judgmental flower, and where natural disasters were considered rude rather than lethal. These worlds produced species that had evolved in what could only be described as nature's luxury resort, where the biggest evolutionary pressure was deciding which fruit tasted better. Then came the middle worlds, Class 4 through Class 7, where life was challenging but manageable, where predators existed but could be reasoned with or at least consistently outrun, and where the weather occasionally reminded you that physics existed but didn't actively try to kill you for sport. And then came the Deathworlds, Class 8 through Class 1-5, where evolution had apparently looked at the concept of survivable conditions and responded with hysterical laughter. These were worlds where the planet itself seemed to have a personal vendetta against the concept of life, where the fauna had evolved 17 different ways to kill you, and where the flora had evolved 12 more just to be thorough. The galaxy, in its infinite wisdom and finite courage, had collectively decided that species from these worlds were either incredibly impressive or deeply disturbed. Often, both. Earth, that small blue marble orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unfashionable arm of the galaxy, had earned itself a solid Class 1-2 Deathworld rating. The Galactic Survey Corps had nearly filed it as a Class 1-3, but the committee decided that was excessive. Right up until they learned about mosquitoes, at which point 3 members tried to retroactively change the classification, but the paperwork had already been processed. The Interstellar Academy for Advanced Species stood as a gleaming monument to galactic cooperation, which was another way of saying it was where the various spacefaring civilizations sent their youth to prove they were better than everyone else's youth. Positioned on Nexus Prime, a neutral Class 2 world that had never experienced anything more dangerous than a light drizzle, the Academy drew students from across 7 spiral arms and 2 irregular satellite galaxies. Its halls gleamed with that particular sterile perfection that suggested someone had taken the concept of educational institution and removed anything resembling character. Holographic displays floated through corridors, showing real-time translations in 4,000 languages, though most students just used their neural implants, like normal people. The architecture was that special kind of inclusive design that meant it was equally uncomfortable for everyone. The student body represented over 200 species, each bringing their own special brand of adolescent arrogance to the institution. There were the crystalline Lithani, who looked down on carbon-based life forms with the disdain of someone who'd never experienced the joy of eating. The gaseous Valen floated through corridors with an air of superiority that was both literal and metaphorical. The Drexen, massive quadrupeds who could bench press a small spacecraft, somehow still found reasons to feel insecure about their academic performance. And then there was Vexith Koran. Vexith belonged to the Zentarii, a species that had won the evolutionary lottery so thoroughly that they'd essentially been handed participation trophies by the universe itself. Reptilian in the way that made other species think. Majestic, rather than cold-blooded, the Zentarii hailed from Zenthar, a Class 2 paradise world where the most dangerous predator was a fruit-eating bird with poor depth perception. Standing at roughly 7 feet with scales that shimmered between emerald and sapphire, depending on the light, Vexith cut an impressive figure through the Academy's corridors. His people had evolved with enhanced cognitive processing, reinforced skeletal structures, and a natural resistance to most toxins' advantages that had absolutely nothing to do with survival pressures, and everything to do with random genetic drift in an environment where evolution had gotten bored. But here's the thing about winning the evolutionary lottery. It doesn't actually make you better, just luckier. Vexith, however, had somehow missed that particular memo. He'd scored in the top percentile of the Academy's entrance examinations, which he attributed to his species' natural intellectual superiority rather than the expensive private tutors his family had employed since he was a hatchling. His combat theory scores were exemplary, earned in simulations that his enhanced reflexes made significantly easier. His tactical assessments were praised by professors, though one might note that tactical thinking was considerably simpler when you'd never faced actual consequences. Vexith had surrounded himself with a carefully curated group of admirers species from other paradise worlds who shared his conviction that their comfortable origins somehow translated to inherent superiority. They moved through the academy like a scaled, feathered, and occasionally tentacled entourage, dispensing judgment on their lesser evolved peers. Deathworlders, Vexith had once pronounced during a cafeteria debate that nobody had asked him to participate in, are evolutionary dead ends. Brute force adaptations, with no finesse, no elegance. They survive through crude resilience rather than true advancement. The fact that he'd made this pronouncement while eating synthesized nutrition paste because his digestive system couldn't handle anything more challenging than pre-processed molecules was an irony lost on absolutely no one except Vexith himself. His academic career had been a steady climb of validation. Professors praised his theoretical knowledge. Simulations bent to his enhanced physical capabilities. His peers from similar backgrounds reinforced his worldview with the enthusiasm of people who'd never had that worldview challenged. Vexith Korin had become the walking embodiment of unearned confidence, a monument to the Dunning-Kruger effect rendered in shimmering scales. The universe, as it so often does, was preparing to teach him a lesson. The universe has a sense of humor. You see a dark, ironic sense of humor that particularly enjoys deflating the pompous. It started on a Tuesday. Well, it was called something unpronounceable in galactic standard that roughly translated to third rotation after the binary cycle, but for sanity's sake, we'll call it Tuesday. The advanced xenobiology and survival theory class had just settled into their seats or hovering positions, or stabilized magnetic fields, depending on species when Professor Thelnax, a wizened Mytharian whose species had evolved past the need for a physical body and now existed as organized energy patterns, made an announcement. Class, we have a new student joining us today. This was unusual. The Academy rarely accepted midterm transfers, and when they did, it was typically some prodigy from a well-connected family who'd been fast-tracked through the application process. The assembled students perked up with curiosity. She comes from a Class 1-2 Deathworld and has met all the necessary qualifications for advanced placement. The classroom's atmosphere shifted immediately. A Class 1-2. Several students instinctively moved their belongings closer to themselves. The Drexen in the third row, despite being large enough to accidentally destroy furniture, leaned away from the door. Even Vexith's entourage exchanged nervous glances. Vexith himself sat up straighter, his scales rippling with disdain. A Deathworlder, here, in advanced classes? This was precisely the kind of barbarism that diluted academic standards. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. She walked in like she owned the place. No, that wasn't quite right. She walked in like she'd never considered that she might not belong, which was somehow more unsettling to the assembled aliens than any aggressive posturing would have been. To human eyes, she would have been entirely unremarkable. Average height, athletic build, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the Academy's standard issue jumpsuit in a shade of blue that was supposed to be universally calming, but mostly just looked bureaucratic. Maybe 20 years old, with that particular quality of young adults who hadn't yet learned to doubt themselves. To alien eyes, she was a catalog of nightmare features. Her forward-facing eyes predator's eyes, marking her as something that chased down prey rather than fled from danger. The Valen in the corner literally retreated into their containment sphere. Those eyes could track movement with binocular precision, judge distances for striking or throwing, lock onto targets with the focus of something that had climbed to the top of a food chain through sheer determination. Her teeth, though, those teeth. When she smiled politely at the class, several species got their first good look at the dental arrangement of an omnivore from a world where omnivore meant we can and will eat anything, including things that shouldn't technically be food. Flat molars for grinding plant matter next to pointed canines designed for tearing flesh, all in the same mouth, suggesting a species that had refused to specialize and instead decided to conquer every available food niche. Her skeletal structure, visible in the way she moved, spoke of endurance adaptations. Humans were pursuit predators, though the galaxy didn't know this yet. This girl's ancestors had literally run prey to death across open savannas, chasing them for hours until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. That legacy was written in her every casual movement. And then there was the thing that disturbed the aliens most: she looked soft. No scales, no exoskeleton, no reinforced hide, just flexible skin that looked like it would tear if you thought about it too hard. The galaxy, in its collective experience, had learned that this was a trap. Species that looked that vulnerable on the outside only came from Deathworlds if they were absolutely terrifying, in ways that weren't immediately visible. "Hello," she said, her voice carrying that particular accent that marked English as her first language, all hard consonants and vowel sounds that the translation matrix struggled to process cleanly. "I'm looking forward to working with everyone." Professor Thelnax gestured toward an empty seat in the third row. "Please, join us." We were just about to begin our discussion on adaptive survival strategies in hostile environments. The human walked to her seat with an easy confidence, seemingly oblivious to the fact that students were leaning away from her like she carried a contagious disease. She dropped her bag, a primitive fabric container, rather than a proper dimensional storage unit, and settled into the chair with the posture of someone who'd never had to worry about predators attacking from behind. Because she was the predator, her ancestors had been the ones attacking. Vexith watched this display with narrowed eyes, his scaled brow ridge lowering, in an expression his species used to indicate contempt. A Deathworlder, here, acting like she belonged. Acting like she was equal to students who'd earned their places through proper evolution on proper worlds. The girl caught him staring and nodded politely, a gesture of acknowledgement. Vexith turned away with a dismissive snort that translated across species lines as pure disdain. The lesson continued, with Professor Thelnax discussing theoretical survival scenarios in various hostile environments. The human who'd introduced herself with a name that the translation matrix rendered as approximately Kira Vance, though the actual phonemes were more complex, contributed to discussions with observations that were simultaneously insightful and deeply disturbing. When discussing water acquisition in arid environments, she casually mentioned that humans could survive drinking their own recycled waste fluids if necessary, a revelation that caused 3 students to exit the classroom for emergency biological processing. When the topic turned to temperature regulation, she noted that humans could survive in temperature ranges from well below freezing to significantly above comfortable levels, and that they'd colonized every climatic zone on their homeworld, including actively volcanic regions and frozen wastelands. The Zentarii student next to Vexith made a note to request a dorm transfer, and when Professor Thelnax asked about predator avoidance strategies, Kira had smiled that predators smile with those omnivores' teeth and said, "Well, on Earth, humans are the apex predator in most environments. We don't really avoid predators so much as decide whether they're worth the effort to fight or just not worth our time." The classroom had gone very, very quiet. Vexith's scales had rippled with anger at this display of primitive arrogance. Apex predator? On a Class 1-2 Deathworld. That was statistically improbable to the point of impossibility. The girl was clearly exaggerating, trying to intimidate her betters with tall tales. Class dismissed with an unusually hurried energy, students filing out while maintaining careful distance from the human girl, who seemed genuinely confused by the wide berth everyone was giving her. Vexith, however, remained seated, his entourage hovering nearby like scaled satellites. He waited until most of the class had cleared, before standing to his full 7-foot height and approaching the human's desk. "Kira Vance," he said, his voice carrying that particular resonance that Zentarii used when they wanted to sound important. "I couldn't help but notice your colorful contributions to today's discussion." Kira looked up from packing her primitive fabric bag, her predator's eyes meeting his without any of the deference he'd expected. "Oh, thanks. I was worried I might be oversharing. Earth stuff probably seems pretty intense to species from calmer worlds." Was she being genuine? The complete lack of bragging tone in her voice threw Vexith off balance for a moment. He recovered quickly, scales shifting to a more aggressive crimson hue. "Intense, yes, let's call it that." He crossed his arms, a gesture that his species used to display dominance. "I think what you call intense is what those of us from more evolved backgrounds would call unnecessarily violent. Survival through brutality rather than intelligence." Kira's HFY's eyebrows, mobile patches of hair above her eyes that apparently served some emotional signaling purpose, rose slightly. "I mean, humans use plenty of intelligence. We just also have good endurance and adaptability. Kind of needed both on Earth." "Precisely my point," Vexith continued, warming to his subject. His entourage nodded along, scaled and feathered heads bobbing in agreement. "Evolution on proper worlds favors mental acuity, technological advancement, civilized traits. Your species, through no fault of your own, was forced into crude physical adaptations. It's almost pitiable." Now Kira's expression shifted to something that humans would recognize as amused patience, but which Vexith interpreted as intimidated respect for his superior intellect. "Right," she said slowly. "So what exactly are you getting at?" "I'm proposing," Vexith announced, loudly enough that the remaining students in the corridor could hear, "a demonstration, a simulated survival scenario standard academy protocol, completely safe. You select the environment. I'll match your performance with actual tactical thinking rather than brute force adaptation. We'll see whose evolutionary path was truly superior." His entourage made encouraging sounds. A few students who'd been leaving stopped to watch this unfold. Kira studied him for a long moment, those forward-facing eyes assessing in a way that made several onlookers uncomfortable. Then she shrugged, a gesture that involved raising and lowering her shoulders in a way that suggested she found this entire situation mildly amusing rather than challenging. "Sure, why not? Could be fun." "Fun," Vexith repeated, his scales rippling with satisfaction. "Yes, I'm sure it will be quite educational for you. Shall we say this Friday? The Academy's Simulation Center, 4th rotation. I'll even let you choose the environmental parameters. Make it as hostile as you like. I want there to be no excuses when the results are concluded." "Friday works," Kira agreed, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Fair warning, though, I'll probably pick something similar to Earth conditions since that's what I'm familiar with." "That okay?" Vexith's laugh was the sound of someone who'd never experienced genuine humility. "My dear Deathworlder, I've trained in simulations of Class 1-4 environments. Your Class 1-2 world holds no terrors for someone with proper preparation and evolved capabilities. Choose whatever makes you comfortable." "All right then," Kira said, and that predator's smile appeared again. "See you Friday." She walked out, and immediately the corridor exploded with chatter. Students who'd witnessed the exchange began spreading the word with the speed that gossip achieved, regardless of species or technology level. By dinner rotation, the entire academy knew the Zentarii prodigy had challenged the Deathworld human to a survival simulation, and she'd accepted. The betting pools opened within the hour. Most money went on Vexith, naturally. He was a known quantity, top marks, proven performance in simulations, enhanced physical capabilities. The human was an unknown, and unknowns from death worlds were generally assumed to be all brute force and no finesse. But there was a minority population of bettors, mostly species from Class 6 and above worlds, who'd had experience with Deathworlders. They quietly placed their money on Kira and said nothing, wearing expressions that suggested they knew something the Paradise Worlders didn't. Professor Thelnax, when informed of the challenge, had simply sighed in the way that energy beings somehow could and approved the simulation booking. This wasn't the first time someone had challenged a Deathworlder student, and it wouldn't be the last. The results, however, were always educational, just not in the way the challengers expected. Friday arrived with that particular energy that preceded Academy-sanctioned spectacles. The simulation center's observation deck was packed with students who'd cleared their schedules specifically for this. The facility itself was impressive, a massive chamber capable of generating fully immersive holographic environments, complete with environmental effects, simulated fauna, and genuine physical challenges. Vexith arrived first, naturally, surrounded by his entourage and wearing a custom environmental suit that had probably cost more than some species' yearly budgets. It was equipped with atmospheric processors, temperature regulators, terrain adapters, and enough technological assistance to make a properly hazardous environment merely inconvenient. He'd spent the last 3 days in intensive preparation, reviewing Earth's environmental parameters, studying human physical limitations, and strategizing optimal approaches. His professors had praised his dedication. His peers had admired his thoroughness. Vexith himself radiated confidence, like a small star radiates heat. Kira showed up 10 minutes before the scheduled start, wearing standard academy athletic wear, basically just flexible fabric that wouldn't restrict movement, and carrying a water bottle. That was it. No technological assists, no environmental suit, no equipment beyond basic hydration. Several spectators exchanged concerned glances. The betting odds shifted slightly. Kira Vance. Vexith greeted her as she entered the preparation area, his tone magnanimous. I appreciate your courage in proceeding with this demonstration despite the obvious disadvantage. There's no shame in forfeiting before we begin. Nah, I'm good, Kira replied, stretching her arms above her head in a way that made her joints pop audibly, a sound that caused 3 nearby aliens to flinch. Did you end up picking the environment, or did I? I forgot who was supposed to choose. You were granted selection privileges, Vexith reminded her, scales shimmering with anticipation. Though I encouraged maximum hostility to ensure a proper test. Right. Kira nodded, approaching the simulation controls, where a technician, a nervous-looking Lithani, whose crystalline structure was vibrating with anxiety, waited. Okay, so I'm thinking we go with something like my home region, Earth, North American continent, mountain range environment. Let's say, elevation around 2,500 meters, mixed forest and rocky terrain, temperature range from about 5 to 25 degrees Celsius with variable weather patterns. Scattered water sources, and for fauna, include the standard predator and prey distribution, maybe some analogs for bears, mountain lions, wolves, that sort of thing. Oh, and make the gravity Earth standard, 1G. The technician's crystalline fingers flew across the controls, programming the parameters. Duration of simulation. 6 hours should be good, Kira suggested, looking to Vexith. That work for you? 6 hours? Vexith had been expecting maybe 2, but he wouldn't show weakness now. Perfectly acceptable. Excellent. Professor Thelnax's voice emanated from the observation speakers. The objective is simple. Survive and reach the designated extraction point on the far side of the simulation zone. You'll be starting from opposite entry points, approximately 10 kilometers apart. The terrain will require navigation, resource management, and adaptation to environmental challenges. May the most evolved participants succeed. That last line earned an appreciative laugh from several observers who recognized professional shade when they heard it. Vexith and Kira moved to their respective entry pods, separate chambers that would immerse them in the simulation from different starting points. The pods sealed with a hiss of hydraulics, and the observation deck screens lit up with split-screen views of both participants' perspectives, plus overhead tactical displays. The simulation loaded with the impressive processing power of technology that had been refined across multiple civilizations. Within seconds, both participants found themselves standing in what appeared to be a completely real mountain wilderness. Vexith's starting point was a rocky outcropping surrounded by dense pine forest. The air, simulated but convincingly real, was thin at this elevation, though his environmental suit compensated immediately. His HUD display activated, showing topographical data, optimal routes, and environmental hazard warnings. The sun was positioned at mid-morning, giving him excellent visibility. He permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The environment was challenging, certainly, but well within his capabilities and technological assistance. Time to show this Deathworlder how a truly advanced mind operated. Kira's starting point was similar, different angle on the same mountain range, same altitude, same general conditions. She stood still for a moment, those predators' eyes scanning the environment with the kind of assessment that came from instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. Then she did something that made several observers confused. She took a deep breath, smiled, and said to herself, "God, I've missed real trees. The simulation trees, the observers wanted to correct her, weren't real." But she'd already started moving. In the observation deck, students leaned forward, the betting pool managers prepared to collect their winnings. Professor Thelnax settled into a comfortable energy configuration that suggested this was going to be interesting. The first hour was, to the casual observer, fairly routine. Vexith moved through the terrain with confident efficiency, his suit's terrain adapters adjusting his footing for optimal purchase on the rocky ground. His HUD highlighted the optimal path toward the extraction point, a route that would take him through a valley, past a river, and up another slope. Estimated time, 5.3 hours. He encountered his first simulated predator 30 minutes in a large canine analog that the simulation had generated based on Earth wolf parameters. It approached through the underbrush with convincing stealth. Vexith's suit alerted him immediately, threat detection systems lighting up his HUD. He activated the suit's sonic deterrent, which emitted a frequency that sent the simulated wolf fleeing with its tail between its legs. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 15 seconds. "Note the application of technology over brute force," Vexith commented for the benefit of the observers, knowing his audio was being broadcast. "There's no need to engage in physical confrontation when intellect provides superior solutions." The observers nodded appreciatively. This was what they'd expected: civilized problem-solving. Kira's first hour looked very different. She moved through the terrain with a fluid efficiency that didn't rely on technological assistance, because she didn't have any. But more than that, she moved like someone who'd grown up in similar environments, reading the landscape with an ease that came from experience rather than HUD displays. When she found a stream, she didn't consult a water purity analyzer, she simply looked at the water's clarity, the presence of certain plant life nearby, the way it moved over rocks, and concluded it was safe to drink. She filled her water bottle without hesitation. When she encountered animal tracks in the soft earth near the stream, she paused to examine them, not with a scanner, but with her eyes and hands, reading information about the animal's size, direction, and how recently it had passed through. And when she encountered her first predator, a simulated mountain lion that had been tracking her for several minutes, she did something that made the entire observation deck go silent. She spotted it before it could ambush her. Those forward-facing predators' eyes caught movement in the peripheral vision, and she turned to face it directly, making herself large, spreading her arms, and making loud, aggressive noises. The simulated mountain lion, programmed with behavioral patterns from Earth fauna, hesitated. This prey was acting like a threat. The lion's programming wavered between attack and retreat protocols. Kira picked up a rock, just a rock, nothing special, and threw it with the accuracy that came from a species that had invented ranged weapons before recorded history. The rock struck the lion's shoulder, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to hurt and surprise. The mountain lion fled. Kira continued walking, talking to herself in a way the audio pickups captured. "Yeah, that's right. Not today, kitty. I've got places to be." In the observation deck, the spectators from Paradise Worlds looked confused. The spectators from higher-class Deathworlds looked unsurprised. The betting pool managers began recalculating odds. Professor Thelnax made a sound. That might have been a laugh if energy beings could laugh. Hour 2 brought weather complications. The simulation had been programmed for variable conditions, and now it delivered. Clouds rolled in with concerning speed, the temperature dropped, and rain began to fall. Not a gentle mist, a proper mountain storm with cold rain that would lower body temperature and reduce visibility. Vexith's environmental suit handled this without issue. Temperature regulators kept him comfortable, his HUD compensated for reduced visibility, and his route recalculated to account for the slippery conditions. The rain was an inconvenience, nothing more. He sheltered briefly under an outcropping. waiting for the worst of the storm to pass, confident in his decision to prioritize comfort and efficiency. Kira, wearing fabric that was rapidly becoming soaked, did not stop moving, and this was where the observers began to understand something about Deathworld evolution. She didn't stop because stopping meant getting cold, and getting cold meant burning calories to stay warm, and burning calories meant needing more food. She kept moving, because that's what pursuit predators did. They maintained activity regardless of environmental conditions, because their prey didn't get to stop, so neither did they. Her pace didn't slow despite the rain. If anything, she moved with more purpose, understanding that the storm was temporary and that maintaining body heat through activity was more efficient than trying to stay warm while stationary. When she crossed a stream that had swollen with runoff, she didn't look for a bridge or a technological solution. She simply found the shallowest point, accepted that she was going to get wet anyway, and waded across with the confidence of someone whose ancestors had crossed countless rivers through pure determination. The observation deck was no longer unanimous in their certainty of Vexith's victory. Hour 3 introduced more serious challenges. The simulation, programmed to escalate difficulty, spawned a scenario that would test both participants. A simulated rock slide that blocked the optimal path, forcing a decision between a risky climb over unstable terrain or a significant detour. Vexith encountered his version first. His HUD immediately calculated the risk's 37% chance of injury with the climb, 0 risk with the detour that would add 2 hours to his journey time. The choice was obvious. He took the detour, moving along the safer path with professional caution. Time estimate to extraction point, 6.8 hours. Still manageable, but concerning. The simulation was proving more time-consuming than anticipated. Kira reached her version of the obstacle 20 minutes later. She stood at the base of the unstable slope, evaluating it with those predator's eyes that had evolved to judge distances and risks with frightening accuracy. Then she started climbing. Not recklessly, she tested each handhold, distributed her weight carefully, moved with the kind of confidence that came from a species that had climbed trees to escape predators and climbed mountains, because they were there. Her hands found holds that Vexith's sensors had classified as unstable, but which could support a human's weight if approached correctly. She made it over the obstacle in 45 minutes, emerging on the other side with scraped hands and elevated heart rate, but significantly ahead of schedule. In the observation deck, the betting pool managers were sweating. Metaphorically for most species, literally for a few. Hour 4 was when Vexith began to realize he might have made a mistake. His route had been optimal based on safety and energy conservation, but optimization assumed that both participants were operating under the same constraints. They weren't. While he'd been taking the safe path, the human had been taking the direct path, and the direct path was shorter. His HUD informed him that Kira was now ahead of him. How was that possible? She didn't have routing software, environmental protection, or technological assistance. She should be behind him, struggling with the elements, deterred by predators. Instead, her tracking beacon showed her approximately 3 kilometers ahead on the route to extraction. Vexith's scales flushed with frustrated determination. This wasn't about demonstrating superiority anymore. This was about not losing to a primitive Deathworlder. He increased his pace, pushing his physical capabilities harder than he'd planned, burning through his suit's energy reserves faster to compensate for the time deficit. Kira, meanwhile, had found a berry bush. She recognized the species, or rather, she recognized the simulation's attempt to recreate an Earth analog species, and was eating them while walking, refueling with the casual efficiency of an organism that had evolved to be an opportunistic omnivore. She hadn't stopped moving. She just added snacking to her forward progress. Hour 5 brought the encounter that would become legendary in Academy history. Vexith, pushing harder now, making up time, came around a bend in the trail and found himself face to face with the simulation's apex predator. A massive bear analog, easily 3 meters tall when rearing up, with claws that could disembowel prey and jaws that could crush bone. His threat detection systems screamed warnings. His HUD outlined 17 different protocols for large predator encounters, all of which essentially boiled down to retreat carefully and find alternate route. Vexith did exactly that, backing away slowly while his sonic deterrent tried to convince the bear that he wasn't worth the effort. The bear, however, was programmed with Earth Bear behavioral patterns, which meant it was curious, persistent, and not easily deterred by weird sounds. The retreat became a rapid withdrawal, that became a controlled run, that became a panic sprint when the bear decided this shiny scaled thing was interesting enough to investigate more closely. Vexith fled, and there's no shame in that it was the tactically sound decision, but fleeing burned time and energy, and by the time he'd successfully lost the bear by crossing a stream and doubling back through terrain too dense for the large predator, he'd lost another 30 minutes and was thoroughly rattled. Kira encountered a similar bear 45 minutes later. The observation deck held its collective breath. The bear rose to its full height, massive and intimidating, programmed with behavioral patterns that had made it the apex predator in countless Earth ecosystems. Kira stopped walking. She didn't run running triggered chase instincts. She didn't approach that was just stupid. She stood her ground, made herself large by raising her arms, and began making noise. Not screaming in panic. Making noise, specific noise. Loud and aggressive, the kind of noise that said, I am also a large predator, and fighting me will be expensive for you even if you win. The bear, programmed with realistic behavioral patterns, ran a cost-benefit analysis that millions of years of evolution had hard-coded into its simulated brain. This human-shaped thing was acting like a threat rather than prey. It wasn't running, it was making itself large and loud. Fighting it would probably result in injury even in victory. The bear, sensibly, decided this wasn't worth it and ambled away to find easier meals. Kira watched it go, waited until it was definitely gone, then continued walking. Big guy, she commented to herself. Definitely bigger than the ones we get back home. Good to know, the simulation doesn't pull punches. In the observation deck, Vexith's entourage had gone very, very quiet. The betting pool managers were having a crisis. Hour 6, the final hour, should have been straightforward. Both participants could see the extraction point on their respective displays. A clearing marked with a signal beacon that would end the simulation. Vexith was exhausted, not physically. Precisely, his suit had handled most of the physical strain, but mentally. 6 hours of heightened alertness, of threat management, of constant routing calculations had worn him down in ways his paradise world upbringing hadn't prepared him for. He could see the extraction point, only a kilometer away now. He could win this. The human might be ahead, but a kilometer was nothing. He could still finish first, still prove his point. Then his suit's power cell hit 5%. The environmental controls began shutting down to conserve energy for critical systems. The temperature regulation failed first, and suddenly Vexith was feeling the actual mountain air temperature, which was cold, very cold, especially after the exertion had made him sweat inside the suit. His terrain adapters went next, and suddenly he was walking on uneven ground without assistance, discovering that his species-enhanced skeletal structure didn't mean much if you'd never actually learned to navigate difficult terrain manually. His HUD flickered, then defaulted to minimal power mode, leaving him with basic navigation only. For the first time in the entire simulation, Vexith was experiencing something approaching actual hardship, and he hated it. Kira reached the extraction point at hour 5 and 43 minutes. She walked into the clearing, saw the beacon, and sat down on a convenient rock to wait for the simulation to end. She was tired, genuinely tired. Muscles fatigued from hours of sustained activity, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came with accomplishment. She drank the last of her water, ate the last of the berries she'd collected, and enjoyed the simulated sunshine. Vexith arrived at hour 6 and 18 minutes. He stumbled into the clearing, his suit's power completely depleted, his scales dulled from exhaustion and cold, his carefully maintained dignity in tatters. He found Kira sitting there, clearly having arrived earlier, looking tired but basically fine. Hey. She greeted him cheerfully. Good job finishing. That bear encounter looked rough. They're scary big, right? Vexith wanted to say something cutting, something that would salvage his dignity, but he was too tired and too cold and too thoroughly defeated. He managed a nod. The simulation ended with a soft chime, and both participants were extracted back to the preparation pods. The observation deck erupted in chaos. Species who'd bet on the human were celebrating. Species who'd bet on Vexith were demanding recounts, claiming the